All right, whenever you're ready, Hannah.
All right, super. So I'm Hannah E Carey. I am a fantasy romance writer, and I am the author of the Tales of Pern Cohen series. Um, a little bit about me. I am a huge fan of romance writing and romance books, but I also really love fantasy and mythology as well. And a fun little fact that readers always seem to find interesting is I actually live on a farm. And we joke that I live in a zoo because I have three horses, a bunch of chickens, a rooster, a dog, and a cat. So my life outside of writing can be very exciting. I myself am what is called an indie author. Or independently published author, so not traditional publishing with a publishing house. I publish all of my own work, and I run a small publishing company with my husband. So that is my background and kind of where I will be coming from when it comes to talking about things like publishing and things like that. Um, so we'll just go ahead and get started. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. And I'm going to start this by, we're going to be talking about fantasy writing and world building. So I'm going to start this off by talking a little bit about fantasy writing, and then we'll delve into the world building some. So go ahead and we can go to the next slide. Okay, so what is fantasy? So one of the really important things, and this goes no matter what way you're publishing, whether you're traditionally publishing or indie publishing, it's really, really important to know what your genre is in regards to your book. So what genre does your book fit in? And I really encourage any writer spend time researching genres so that you can find the right genre for your particular story, because that is going to be key to reaching your target audience. And also, if you're traditionally publishing, you're going to need to know that genre when it comes time for querying and finding an agent and things like that. So knowing what your genre is extremely important. So fantasy fiction is a genre of writing of books. And fantasy is basically considered where you've got a story that is set in a fictional universe, and it's often going to feature some sort of magical or supernatural elements to it. Sometimes this gets called speculative fiction, and it gets lumped under what they call speculative fiction. But with fantasy, it does not have to be tied to reality or scientific fact like you would find in science fiction. Fantasy fiction, traditionally, generally speaking, is often inspired by myth and folklore, and it does have its roots in oral tradition. Um, Traditionally speaking, when everybody thinks fantasy, we think things like Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones. It's often synonymous with ideas and stories about medieval style worlds with medieval style values and social structures, but it doesn't have to be. To me, one of the best things about fantasy is that it doesn't have to fit into the real world. It doesn't have to fit into any sort of historical elements. You can create your own worlds in this. They don't have to fit into that medieval box. So one of my big things with fantasy is I feel like it allows people to tell their own unique story. And I think in recent years we've seen more of that, where we not only have, like, kind of the traditional Lord of Rings, sword and sorcerer type fantasy, but we've got some other more diverse fantasies up and coming in the book world in recent years, which I think is a really great thing. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. And so we talked about genre. Genres get really, like, it gets to be kind of a complex thing, right? Sometimes, because we've got your main genre, which would be something like fantasy, science fiction, romance, mystery, suspense, thriller. And then you also have underneath, like, the broad genres, then you've got what they call subgenres. And most of your genres, fantasy being one of them, there's a ton of different quote unquote subgenres. I listed a couple on here. If you go online and start looking around, you're going to find that there's a lot of them. So I just listed a couple that we'll kind of go over just to kind of give you guys a little bit of a taste of what's out there. So first we have what's called high or sometimes epic fantasy. that's set in a world completely different from our own. Usually it's going to have some sort of magical element and kind of its own rules and laws of nature. Again, Lord of the Rings is like one of the biggest, famous things when it comes to high epic fantasy. Then you've got low fantasy, which is going to be something that's set in the real world, and it's often going to have fantasy or magical elements. Urban fantasy, which has gotten really popular in recent years, is a pretty well known example of what would be considered low fantasy. Um, You've got dark fantasy, which often combines the elements of fantasy and horror. And then my personal favorite, fantasy romance, or sometimes this is called romantic fantasy. Those two terms kind of get used interchangeably. That is a story that's going to combine elements of fantasy and romance. So it's going to be a fantasy setting. The romantic relationship is going to be a very key an integral piece of the story. And when it comes to fantasy subgenres, there is kind of always some discussion with a lot of this stuff, where everybody kind of has a little bit of their own opinion about what fits where. But again, finding your genre, figuring out what your story is about, you can pretty easily pinpoint where exactly your story is going to fit, and that's going to help you market, find your audience, advertise, find your publisher, etc. So we'll go ahead and go to the next slide. And now we're going to get into the world building aspect of this. So world building is kind of like, sometimes say like the holy grail of fantasy writing. This is what makes fantasy rather unique. Okay. So I'm gonna preface this by saying this is my experience. These are my experiences as world building. This is how I world build. I really think that it's important when it comes to writing, and I always tell other writers, and some of the best advice that was given to me was you got to find what works for you. So this has been my experience and, kind of my method for when I use world building, but everybody's different. So I always say take it with a grain of salt because what works for me might not work for someone else. So one of the biggest things that I tell folks when it comes to world building, one of the biggest things that helped me was to keep writing. A lot of the times, in particular, I think when we're writing fantasy, we can get really, really bogged down in this idea that we have to have the world perfectly put together before we even get to telling the story, or we'll stop telling the story because we feel like we have to go back and fix the world. And then a lot of the times, the stories never really go anywhere. So one of my biggest encouragements would be don't let yourself get so bogged down in the world building that you stop working on writing your story. That's, I think, one of the key things. I see the story itself, the plot, the characters, the storytelling as sort of the cake, and the world building is the icing that goes on top that makes that cake a little bit better than it would be without it. Your stories and your character are at the heart of what you're creating. You can have the best world building in the world, but if you don't have a story that resonates and you don't have characters that resonate, it's just not going to have that strong of a feeling as if you had all three of those things working together. Also, another big thing that I think is important with world building is that your world building needs to be connected to your story and your characters, which we'll talk about a little bit more as we get into this, how you can kind of connect those three pieces together. Again, that idea that your story, your characters, and the world that you've created, they're dynamic pieces and they're working together as you tell the story to your audience. So I don't necessarily like to think of them as like three separate things that are on like three separate planes or in three separate areas. But I think of them all working together in this dynamic manner that's helping me tell the story to my audience. One thing that I have learned when it comes to world building is that I often learn more about my world by writing my story. Before I published my first book, um, I had a good 5 books in my series written that are not all published at this point, but will be coming out in the next couple of years. And I actually really did learn more about the world that I created by writing those 5 stories than I think I would have if I tried to get all of that done ahead of time. So You need that basic idea of your world, I think, to start your story so that you know where you're going and you know some basic things. But I know a lot of writers, and I've had this happen to me, where we get stuck in world building prep and we think that before we tell the story, we have to have the world perfect, and you don't. It's really not necessary. Some basic things, yeah, sure, but don't let that stop you from keeping the process moving forward. And I always tell everybody, it's why we have editing. Your rough drafts are going to be imperfect. If the world building isn't perfect when you get that first, draft or two down, that's fine. That's one of the reasons as writers we go back and edit. You can always change things as you process through the writing process. And that's something that I've done and I've had happen for me, where I just, as I'm going through the drafting process, I realize I need to address a certain thing or I need to figure out a certain thing about the world. And as I'm doing the writing, I'm kind of having the world building go along with it. Um, and editing, I think, is such a powerful tool for that. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. All right, so I want to talk about some things that I think are important when it comes to world building, not only to help you get the basic idea of what your world is going to look like, but also things that you can be asking yourself, as you're telling the story, as you're working on your world building. So one of the first basic things I think is important to think about is the terrain or the natural topography. So what does your world look like is one of the first questions that you're going to want to ask yourself. Um, and it's fantasy, so it can look like something that exists in this world, or can be based off of something that exists in this world, or it can be something totally different. For me, I tend to work best when I at least have something that's at least based off of something that exists in the real world. And a lot of the times, what I will do, what I will recommend to folks is, even if it's just something that's loosely based off of an environment that exists in our universe, go pull up photos. Just go pull up photos of that place, of that particular terrain, and put those in front of you so that when you sit down to write out what does my world look like or what does the terrain look like, you've got that kind of inspiration, that reference point with you when you're working that out. So for my world, one of the island that it largely takes place on. I largely base that off of the Northeast, in particular Maine and the Maine coast. And even more in particular, I based it off of Acadia National Park up in Maine. So I have a lot of photos of that area that I use as a reference point when it comes to ironing out details about the world and the terrain. Again, just as a reference point to me to give me something to work off of. So another thing I think, you really need to think about when it comes to the terrain is we need to know what it looks like, but you also need to think about how is that going to affect the people that live there, because that's going to be a key part of that. Knowing what it looks like, but the people or creatures or whatever lives there, because now this fantasy doesn't necessarily have to be people, but whatever is living there, how is it affected by the terrain, by the natural environment? Because that is going to dictate a lot of how your culture works in that world, how society works in that world, their day-to-day life is going to be affected by the place, the terrain that they're living in. Maps are hugely helpful when it comes to this. And, in most fantasy books, I think all of us, when you open the front flap, you see the map. And I always tell everybody they are for the reader, but they're for you as the writer as well. So one of the things that, I always tell everybody, like my drawing, I am not an artist in the visual sense. And I think a lot of the times, a lot of us writers aren't. But go ahead and get yourself a rough map so that you at least have a general idea of what your world looks like and what the area looks like. That's going to be really, really important when it comes to writing your story and it comes to moving these characters around this world. You're going to, again, just need that reference point of what things look like and where things are. If you're writing a fantasy with real world elements, so something like an urban fantasy, this is the point where you want to decide what real world elements are going to be in place and what fantasy elements are going to exist and how are they going to interact together. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to talk about maps a little bit more. And so these are two maps that I had commissioned for my story. Um, this is not what they looked like when I first created them. When I first created them, they were hand drawn by me, and trust me, they did not look this good, but they had the basic idea of like the shape of the land, where the mountains were, where the rivers were, where like the towns and stuff were. So that was my reference point when I was, writing, was using my hand-drawn maps. And then when I got closer to publication, I commissioned these maps to be made by a graphic designer. I sent him my hand drawings, and he did a really fabulous job of making these much better looking digital maps for me. And these are in my books, yes, but I also have copies of these that I keep at my desk. And for me, especially since I'm writing a series and I'm continually going back to this world, I cannot tell you how many times I refer back to these all the time. These, for me as a writer, especially as a fantasy writer, they are an invaluable tool to, again, help me make sure I've got continuity and kind of help me decide how I want to move my characters around this world. So I really recommend, if you're doing fantasy writing, just start out by hand drawing your own maps so that you've got something that works for you. And then at some point you can get them commissioned to a more digital drawing. But like I said, for me, these are an invaluable thing for me to have that I still use all the time. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So social elements. So we talked about the terrain, what your world looks like, how that's going to, affect your writing and your world building. But social elements are also going to be a part of that. So what social elements are going to be in place in your world? And this may be jobs, government, religion, etc. You can, again, it's fantasy, so you can be creative with this, you can experiment, you can be diverse. In my series, because it is a fantasy, I have a social society where it is extreme, equality between men and women is a very huge part of their social structure. I have another society that's very, very patriarchal. You can really, it's fantasy, so you have the ability to experiment with this and be diverse. And this is where I always say, yes, traditionally, fantasy tends to be based in that medieval society, but it doesn't have to be. One thing that I do always tell people with social elements is you do need that to be related to your characters and your story. You don't want to be throwing social elements in there that have nothing to do with the story or the characters, because that is going to be what we often call the dreaded info dump. It's just going to be more information than the reader needs, and it's going to bog them down. So, again, I think government is a big one that often has to do with, the story of how do these people govern, what's the structure of government that they use. Jobs is another big one. Religion, especially depending on the type of characters that you have, can be very, very important. But those are elements that you want to think about. How does the world that you've created, how do they function as a society, with each other? What are their values? What are the things that they deem important? I think are all very good questions to ask yourself when you're going through the world building process. So we can go ahead to the next slide. History. So this kind of goes back to social elements a little bit, but again, same idea. This, society that you're creating, this world that you're creating, what is its history? What's the history of the world? What's the history of the people or creatures that inhabit it? What are their stories? What are their traditions? I talked about at the beginning this idea that fantasy is rooted in mythology and oral traditions. This is kind of it right here. This society that you're creating. What is their history? How do they explain the world around them? And what I think this does when it comes to world building is it helps create a fuller world for the reader, and it makes the world feel more grounded in reality, so that when the reader is reading it, they feel like it's real. Really good fantasy books, you tend to feel like that place could maybe exist somewhere in some, realm or what have you, but it feels very real. And part of what makes it feel real, I really feel like, is making sure that you've asked yourself, what are the stories, what are the history, etc. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to give an example of how I did this for my book series that I've got. So it focuses on an island that's called Permcoen, and one of the things that I did is I developed their creation myth. So this kind of goes into, history, oral tradition. Basically, how did these people explain the world around them? And so in this world, there's five different clans, and they're each represented by an animal spirit. And I wanted to tie these spirits back to these people's culture. So I started with the creation myth. If you look at it, every civilization has their own creation story. It's a very human thing that we do. There's lots of stories that civilizations have in common, but a creation story or creation myth is a big one. So that's why I decided to start with this. In this particular myth or story, what I'm doing is this culture is telling how their world came into being. So the island itself, the mountains being pushed up out of the water, the trees being pulled out of the earth, how the rivers came into being. So this is kind of this culture explaining how the natural world around them came to being. This would be their oral tradition of telling it, that in my mind they would be telling, around the fire to their children, etc. Also for me, for my particular story in this creation myth, the second half of it, after first showing, okay, how did this world come into being, then I also show that these five animal spirits aren't the only animal spirits inhabiting this world. We have three other ones as well. And in the second half, I set up this light and dark, dichotomy, where we have these darker spirits that are explaining things like why there's death in this world, why there's decay, why there's destruction, etc. So explaining why those things happen. Um, and when I created this, I wanted it to have the feeling of something that was an oral tradition. So something that would be passed down, um, from the elder generation of the society to the younger generation. I really do encourage fantasy writers. I know it's not always the most fun thing, but go back and read old oral traditions. Read things like Beowulf. Read things like the Iliad, because that's going to kind of give you that understanding and that idea of this idea of being able to create a society, being able to create a history, things like that. They're going to help the world that you're creating feel more real. And one thing that I always think about with this, that I think is important, that I always tell people with this, that I think can kind of make a difference when you're working on this, world building and something like a creation story or something like that. For these people that I'm writing about, this story for them is real. It's not a bedtime story. It's not a joke. This is their real history. It's what ties them to their land, and it ties them to each other. And culturally, that's very important for people, just human beings in general. So being able to have that approach to it when you're working on it, just taking the attitude of like, okay, I'm going to do this in a way where, I'm really looking at it as this is real to these people, it's important to these people, I think can make a big difference, just in tone and the way that it comes across when you're writing. So again, kind of what I was talking about at the end of there. Someone's culture is not a fantasy. This is one of the things I always tell people with world building. World building is creating a culture, but I think in order to do it in a respectful manner, we have to understand that someone's culture is not their fantasy. Because world building in and of itself is basically building a culture or cultures. That is something that's very real, in the world, and that's something that's very real and important to us as human beings. And I do think it's really, really important that as fantasy writers, we approach the idea of culture respectfully. And we understand that, when we're maybe doing research about other cultures or learning about other cultures that maybe we want to bring back to our story, we have a respectful attitude of that, of knowing that to these people that we're reading about or talking about, that is something that's very real for them. It's a very integral part of their life. And I think if it can be done that way, I think it tends to create a much more authentic and much more impactful story for the reader. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about this idea of how do you blend your world building and your story together, so that we talked about the plot, the characters, and the world building being three dynamic pieces that are working together. So how do we blend those things together, so that you get the finished product, which is a very fascinating, interesting, and engaging fantasy story. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, so this is my opinion. World building in and of itself to me is not a story. It's a part of a story, but just the world building in and of itself isn't a story. So we need something to keep the story moving forward, to keep the reader engaged. And while the world around it can be very, very engaging, that isn't necessarily the plot. So we want that plot in there to keep the story itself moving forward. For me as a writer, and this is just me, this is one of those things where I tell everybody, everybody's different. For me as a writer, I tend to world build around my plots and around my characters instead of doing it the other way. For me, the plot and the character is central, and then the world building kind of comes around that. So you want to think about, when you're doing your world building, when you decide what elements of your world building you're going to include, what ties in with your story, what ties in with your plot, what ties in with your characters. Kind of be asking yourself that question when you're trying to decide, what world building elements do I need to include to tell this story. You don't want the dreaded info dump, which can be really, really difficult with fantasy writing, because this is a completely new world and we do need to tell the audience about it. But we don't want to tell the audience about it to the point where they just start tuning out and then they're skipping whole paragraphs, or they maybe don't even want to finish the book, because we've kind of taken an engaging story and just turned it into a list of things about this world that isn't necessarily going to be very engaging to the audience. And that's where I think this idea of blending the world building and the story can really come in handy. So you want to ground your reader in the world while not overwhelming them. You want to make them feel like this place is real, but you don't want to overwhelm them with too much information. And blending the world building and the story can make the story a lot richer. So you use the pieces of the world building that you add into your story to enrich the storyline and help the story keep moving forward. And this idea of moving forward, it can move forward via plot, via action, which is important, but it can also move forward relationally, whether that be in relationships between certain characters, or that's in whether that's the character's interior, kind of inner relation, yeah, sorry, their internal character development. Those things, along with the idea of action, can move the story forward. And I do think it's important in a good fantasy story that you have both of those things. So you have action that's moving the story forward, and then you have either a relationship development or internal character development that's moving the story forward, and you kind of weave those things into your plot. um, you want to blend in conversations, day-to-day interactions, occurrences, you know, where you can blend the world building into that. So again, it just seems like it's part of the story. You don't want to jar the reader out of, the reading experience or out of the plot, because you kind of take them away from what's going on and you give them a bunch of information that they don't necessarily need. One example that I have of this from my debut novel that I did, just to kind of give you an example of this idea of blending, is again, we're talking about, you've got action that's moving the plot forward, or you've got, character relationships or interior character development that's moving the plot forward. So this was going to be a scene where I was going to be character relationships and in her character development was going to be moving the story forward. We just had a bunch of action beforehand, and then things were kind of slowing down. So in this scene, it's a conversation between the hero and the heroine, and I used an action of what the hero was doing. I had him making arrowheads. That gave me an opportunity to, again, this idea of culturally, what that means for, his culture, what that means for him. That allowed me to tie in some of the cultural aspects of the world building just in that action alone. Um, and then I had him speaking with the heroine about his mother. And that conversation allowed me to bring in not only, his relationship with his mother and societally, that parent child relationship, what that was, but it also allowed me to bring in another cultural aspect, in that I was able to bring in a oral story that was told by his mother, that related to the hero's culture and his beliefs. And it was a story that illustrated some differences between his culture and beliefs and the heroine's culture and beliefs. And so I was able to throw those pieces in there so that you were getting that world building and you were getting those pieces, but you weren't necessarily getting overwhelmed by stuff that didn't have anything to do with the story itself. Um, so blending, in my opinion, it makes the story a lot richer. It is going to help your audience or your reader, again, not get jarred out of the story. It's going to make it just seem like it all flows and fits very, very nicely. And one of the biggest things that I think is important to remember with world building is it is a tool. In fantasy writing, it is an important tool because you're writing about a world that doesn't exist, or at least part of it doesn't exist in the real world. So you've got to give your audience some sense of place of where they are. But it's still just a tool to give the reader a more immersive experience. So to make them really feel like they're in this place with these characters, um, you know, on whatever journey that they're on. So I think the next slide is questions, and yeah, I'm happy to take any questions. We can go to the next slide. I think that's what the next slide is. It's just, yeah. So I'm happy to take any questions about that if anybody has any.
Wow, wonderful info, Hannah. Does anyone have any questions? Go ahead and use that chat box. Again, when you hover over the top of people's names, it is the third one from the right. There's an example there. Okay, Samantha asks, what are your favorite resources for writers?
My favorite, what sounds really awful, my favorite, or maybe not awful, maybe not awful isn't the right word. My favorite resources when it comes to world building, and this probably has a lot to do with my literature background in college, my favorite resources when it comes to world building, what I have found most useful is going back and reading old texts from various cultures. That is, and reading about various cultures and various civilizations. That's one of the things that I feel like for me as a writer, I've found most helpful. So with my story, with my series that I have out right now, um, I have one culture where I read a lot on Greek and Roman ancient culture and Greek and ancient Roman mythology. And then I have another culture where I spent a lot of time reading up and studying on Celtic culture and Celtic mythology. So I went back, and read as much as I could about those cultures. I read as many old, stories, myths, legends, etc. That's what I found the most helpful to help me create an authentic culture and give it an authentic feeling.
And Marilyn says, thanks for sharing, Hannah. Have you and your husband published other authors? How do you promote the sale of your books and the books you publish?
We do not publish other authors. We just do my work. We have an LLC set up that we do my work under. When it comes to promotion, when you're an indie, you've got a lot of options, but you do have to promote. So I do paid advertising. I do as much free advertising as I can. a lot of the advertising I do online in this day and age, because you have, Amazon has its own advertising. You've got BookBub, which is a big book site that has advertising. As many events like this local author fest for me, this huge help as an indie writer because it helps me connect with people. I'm very active on social media. Um, Basically anything that I can do as far as, advertising and getting my name out there. A lot of it, like I said, nowadays you're doing online or on social media. As much of that I can do, I do.
Okay, James asks, do you spend more time describing the physical world or the cultural world?
I think they go hand in hand because usually the physical world, if you look at it again, kind of historically, if you're looking back at different societies, they tend to me they tend to go hand in hand. The physical world is going to have an impact on the cultural world. So I try and balance it to where I am describing both. And for me, I feel like those two things go together. So like you saw in that creation myth, I have the different animal spirits that's describing the physical world. So, this is an island that's in the middle of the ocean. So, how did the mountains come up out of the ocean? How do they get the trees? But then, what I also did is culturally, along with that, these different spirits that created these different physical elements. I went back and did a lot of research on, what do ancient societies what values did they place on things like trees, water, etc. What values did they maybe place on various animals? And so then what I ended up doing as you read the books is you discover that not only do these animal spirits have an impact on explaining how the physical world came into being, but then you have like the Wolf Clan highly values loyalty, they highly value family. I kind of blended those things together. So you got kind of the cultural aspect of that as well. So I think they're intertwined. I think they go together. I think you kind of can't have one without the other. So I just try and balance it in my work.
Great questions for everyone. Does anyone else have any questions? Oh, here comes one from Olive. What fantasy books do you recommend to read that would help a novice fantasy writer?
I think one of the biggest things you're going to want to do is figure out, so your genre is fantasy. Um, Try and figure out what your subgenre is going to be or what subgenre interests you. And then go start reading in that genre or that subgenre. As far as particular ones, I read fantasy romance. So, or I write fantasy romance. That's a lot of what I read. And that in and of itself is a very, very broad. You've got a lot of different things, even in that broad kind of subtopic. So that's what I read, but that may not be the subgenre you want to write. So I would just encourage you. I think as writers, we have to be readers. And I think it's really important that we read not only in our genre, but in our subgenre as well. So see if you can figure out what interests you the most in fantasy, and then just go on and see what books in that genre are popular. What are the books that people are raving about in that genre, and just kind of start going through and reading. And really in reading, you just want to pay attention to what are the authors who are doing it well doing. You kind of have to learn to be, as a reader, not necessarily just reading for enjoyment, but also just starting to notice what are the authors that are doing this well in my genre, subgenre. What things are they doing? Um, yeah, that would be my biggest, and you can go on and like go on to Google or like Goodreads or Amazon and like top 100, fantasy books, or, top 100 urban fantasy books, and just kind of start going through and figuring out what resonates with you.
Okay, the next question comes from Katrina. Any advice on world building in cultures that aren't a monolith? My novel in progress has turned into a juggling act of multiple species who all have their own beliefs and customs.
Um, yeah, that can be tricky. So in my I don't have multiple species in my series that I'm writing right now, but I do have multiple cultures, and they're like you're saying, they have their own beliefs and customs. So the culture in the on the island is very different from the empire that's in the south. Um, so one of the things that I found really helpful is I actually keep, I call it my series Bible. I keep a 3-ring binder. I don't think I have it over here. I keep a 3-ring binder where I keep track of the different cultures. And I basically, this is one thing I always tell people. I think when it comes to fantasy in particular, you're going to do a lot of stuff for you that doesn't even necessarily get in your book. So, actually, yes, I've got it right here. So, this is my series Bible, and I've got stuff in here. You can see I've got my maps. I've got all kinds of stuff in here. I'm going to see, I don't know if you can see it. I have genealogy records. Deities, beliefs, things like that. And a lot of the stuff is stuff that my audience is probably, like my reader is probably never going to see all of that. A lot of that is just for me, like you were saying, to keep track of those cultures when you have different cultures. So that's been one of the easiest things for me to do, is to have that series Bible that I just keep up to date with all of that information, so that when I need it for the story, I can just flip back through and kind of remember, like, okay, like this culture, values this thing, or they find they have this custom, etc.
Any last minute words you want to leave the audience with, Hannah?
If you are interested, like I said, I have a series out now. I've got the first 2 books of the series. You can go to my website, www.hannahecarey.com, and that can give you more information about the books. And that is also going to be able to take you to buy links. They're available in both ebook and paperback. So if you're interested in any of those, check that out at my website. And if you are interested in following me on social media or YouTube, I have a YouTube channel where I post up writing tips for fantasy writers. But I also, with my equestrian background, and I think a lot of us that do fantasy, a lot of the time, especially if some medieval horses tend to be in there, I post up equine tips for writers as well there.
Okay, so we do have a question from Andy. Any tips for sci-fi versus fantasy?
Science fiction, a lot of your science fiction readers are going to, well, kind of in the name, I feel like science fiction readers tend to care a little bit more about the laws of physics than fantasy readers do. So I think when it comes to science fiction, you do need to kind of delve a little bit more into that scientific background with things. I myself have not written science fiction at this point, although my husband is a scientist. He does science for a living, so I may at some point do that, but I'm going to have to pick his brain about it. I think that's one of the biggest, to me, I think that's one of the biggest differences. In fantasy, because you have magic, a lot of the times readers are okay with a lot of stuff being chalked up to magic. Whereas in science fiction, I think a lot of the times there is that expectation that you're going to have some understanding of certain scientific facts.
All right,
But
and we have, oh, sorry, were you still going?
Oh, I was just going to say, I do think one of the overlapping things with science fiction and fantasy is that cultural aspect. Even in science fiction, because you've got different planets, and you've got, let's look at Star Wars as one of the first ones that comes to mind. You've got different species, but I do think that cultural aspect is still present in sci-fi like it is in fantasy.
All right, James asks, I write a fantasy series. Do you have a history of family names?
I do. I've had to do that with my series. It's one of the things I had to start doing in my story Bible, especially now that I've got the 3rd book out for edits, and I'm working on the 4th book, which is now I'm getting into like the 2nd generation of characters. So I have had to go back and do that the past few months. It's one of the reasons I wrote like the family, like genealogy of who's related to who. I ended up having to go back and write basically like family histories and world histories and stuff like that too, just for continuity. Also to make sure I wasn't reusing names and, who was related to who and all of that. And I've kept that in that series Bible so that I can reference it when I'm writing books if need be, because I honestly can't remember every single detail all of the time, and I don't want to have to look back through my old books. I'd prefer it just be all in one place.
Great. Anything else for Hannah? All right. Thank you so much, Hannah.
Thank you for having me.